Well, here we are in the second week of Advent, as I mentioned, and we're also in the second week of our current message series, and we're calling this series Saved in Hope. And hope is something that we particularly need in these days because, after all, here we are 8 months on from the beginning of this thing, but still seemingly stuck in the middle of the pandemic. And despite some progress in terms of medical treatment and testing and the development of a vaccine, here on the ground in the local communities, in terms of case numbers at least, things seem to be even worse today than they were back then, back in March and April. It's all a bit depressing. We are longing for this thing to be over, to escape from our fear, to return to normal, to the life we once had. But we don't know when that day will come, and we don't know what normal will look like. And in an intriguing way, we are sharing that experience with the people of ancient Israel. That is the historical point of origin of the first readings that we hear at Mass during this season of Advent. Whether those readings speak of longing or report God's promises to his people, that is their point of origin. They were all written hundreds of years before Jesus was born in Bethlehem. At that time, Israel was a defeated nation, defeated in war, exiled, banished from their home, discouraged, more than ready for her trials and tribulations to come to an end. And so are we. And not just when it comes to COVID. Each of us has had, or will have trials and tribulations of our own. Burdens we don't feel able to carry. So how do we persevere in the face of discouragement, in the midst of the powerful presence of suffering and sometimes even defeat? How do we do it? Well, hope is the answer to those questions, and hope is perhaps the most typical theme of this season of Advent. Okay, so where do we find hope? Well, there are many answers, there are many places. Because to persevere in this life, whomever you may be, Christian or not, to persevere in this life, we all need hope. And so, resourceful creatures that we human beings are, we find hope. We find it in many different places. Some of us find it in ourselves, in our own strength and resolve. Sometimes we find it in love. We find it in our relationships with our family and friends. These bring us hope. Sometimes we find it also in the advances of science and technology, and we can think in a particular way about this situation with the pandemic. All of these can bring us comfort in difficulties, and they can even bring us hope. But ultimately, these things are what Pope Benedict XVI in his letter on Christian hope called small hopes. Yes, they can bring real comfort, and even in a sense, real hope. But they, and the hope they bring, are incomplete because ultimately they are temporary. They are small hopes. The hope that ancient Israel and each of us and all of us as human beings are truly searching for needs to be something more than that. And Pope Benedict calls what we're searching for the great hope. And that hope comes to us from and in the person of Jesus Christ. Our great hope is found in knowing that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. We know that. And that knowledge comes to us first as a gift in our baptism, but it also demands something from us. Like faith, hope is first a gift from God. But also, like faith, without our cooperation, without our active participation, hope can and will sometimes shrivel and die. So what is our part? What does hope ask of us? That's what we're looking at in this series, the virtues that allow hope to remain alive and even to grow within us, that with God's grace give us a share in that great hope. And here they are. First, hope requires patience. Second, hope flows from trust, from faith. Third, hope demands discernment, wise judgment. Finally, hope is built on obedience, on careful listening. Now, last week we talked about patience, about how we need to cultivate patience in our life by choosing regularly to step outside the busyness of our daily life and to recognize the bigger story in which we are living and of which we are and our lives are a part. The story of a love from which even death cannot separate us. The story of our great hope. And we looked last week at the practice of the 1-minute pause as a way to help us do that. If you missed that last week, you can check it out on our website. The previous installments are there. Now this week, we're going to look at how true hope, our great hope, also flows, as I said, from a relationship of trust. Hope flows from faith. Now in our culture, faith, at least religious faith, is often considered to be something irrational, a choice that is made to believe in something that the evidence just doesn't support. This is the common portrait of faith. But the truth is that religious faith is a particular example of a more general category, because faith is part of life, everyone's life. We all take many things in our life on faith. And we also make important life-changing decisions based on faith. And so necessarily, we make them also in hope. And among the most important of those decisions are in the area of friendship and love, our relationships. I'm going to take a little detour now into the meetings that I have with couples that are preparing to be married. There are several of those meetings, and at one of the first, in fact, the very first meeting usually, I ask them a series of questions. I ask them about lifelong marriage, about faithfulness to their spouse. And then I ask them this: do you understand and agree that in marriage you are to share with your spouse an openness to have and to nurture children? I have never had anyone answer no to that question. Some of you may remember that question being asked of you. Now, I'm guessing that here today at this Mass, and certainly over the course of all of our Masses this weekend, we have been joined by a good number of grandparents. And I'm going to ask you grandparents for a moment, and parents, you can try this as well. It's just that you don't have quite the history to cast your mind back over. I'm going to ask you to think back on your life as a parent, on your relationship with your children in particular. You will no doubt remember moments of great joy and deep happiness. But some of you may also remember moments of deep frustration and perhaps even profound, soul-wrenching pain. There may even, over the course of this weekend, have been some with us today who have lost a child and experienced the pain that comes from that experience. And all of these things you are remembering, the joyful and the sorrowful, all of them have flowed from your yes, from your promise to be open, to have, and to nurture children. Now, as I said, no one has ever said no when I ask them that question, but I wonder how many moments there have been over the years, how many moments on your journey towards this moment, towards today, how many moments have there been along the way when it might have felt like you weren't quite able to carry the full weight of your yes. But here you are. The truth is that when you said yes to that question, you were not being irrational, you weren't being impractical, you weren't being religious, even if you were religious. The truth is that whoever you are and whatever you believe, when you say yes to that kind of a question, you speak in faith. You speak into a future you do not know. And you speak in hope. There is simply no other way to say yes. Pope Benedict puts it like this: In the end, even the yes to love is a source of suffering, because love always requires the expropriation of my I, in which I allow myself to be wounded. Love simply cannot exist without this painful renunciation of myself, for otherwise it becomes pure selfishness and thereby ceases to be love. Do you understand and agree that in marriage you are to share with your spouse an openness to have and to nurture children? From a purely pragmatic, practical, self-preservation point of view, the point of view of maximizing my own happiness, for me to say yes to that question is irrational. But from a fully human perspective, to say no is the truly irrational response, because to say no is to condemn myself to a life without a particular kind of meaningful and profound relationship, a life without a particular kind of love. A more protected life, it's true. Perhaps we might say even a safer life. But in the end, a much narrower, smaller, and less fully human life. So faith is the true foundation for hope. And as we have seen, faith doesn't just mean reciting the words of the Apostles' Creed. Saying yes to a lifetime commitment like marriage or bringing children into the world depends on faith. Because in making that choice, in making that promise, we open ourselves to the world in the person of our spouse and our children, and give them an authority and a power over our life and our future that we would never freely give in the world of business or politics. The power to wound us. And just as Christian faith is a specific example of a more general category, so too is Christian hope. Like ancient Israel, and like couples preparing for marriage, we Christians look into the future, a future that includes the possibility, the real possibility of suffering and danger. And we see something more. We see the possibility of love. The kind of love from which even death cannot separate us. And just as we say yes to all the possibilities that come with lifelong marriage and parenthood, so in faith and in hope, we Christians say yes to a profound and meaningful relationship, a life-giving relationship with God, along with all that such a relationship might bring. The trials and suffering that are part of our life, for example, the months and months of pandemic, months of isolation, loneliness, fear, and disruption, all of these mysteriously, in some way, are connected, are part of our yes to God. But there is more. There is hope. The kind of hope we heard proclaimed in the words of the prophet Isaiah in our first reading. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, and that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. And so, in hope, we say yes to God, but he also says yes to us. Indeed, our very existence, our very presence on this earth is already a sign of his yes to us, a sign of his love. A love from which neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us. A love and a relationship that breaks the bonds of death. That is what we are all searching for. That is what the Lord offers us. That is what we find in Jesus Christ, who is our great